Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. Just talking, Rubina, about the fact that I have actually been in Bangladesh before. When I came to Bangladesh, I was 21 years old, and I worked for a year for Heed Bangladesh. Most of my time in Dhaka, but also Sylhet. So it's been a long time since I've been here, but it's fantastic to be back again. So I thank Shaila Sultana for inviting me, and I look forward to talking with you today. I've changed the title of my talk a little bit. The language policy in the global south, monolingualism, multilingualism, and English as a world language. But before I start, I thought I would just give you a little bit of background on me, so you know who I am, for those of you who don't know me. So I'm a Pākehā, this is a Māori word for white New Zealander. I grew up in a part of New Zealand, was resolutely monocultural, monolingual, and very colonial, a place called Christchurch, Otautahi in Māori, and it liked to pride itself on being a little bit of Britain in the South Pacific. So it's a very monocultural experience growing up, and it was really only as an adult, when I first trained as a secondary school teacher, a high school teacher, that I first learnt Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, as an adult language learner, and became interested in issues around bilingualism, biculturalism, and wider issues in terms of linguistic and diversity. And so my work explores and critiques the limits of the monocultural and monolingual precepts underpinning still so much language policy and practice, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that continues to be the case today. And in terms of my overall work, I have a number of interests, but my key interests revolve around 5 key themes: language rights, Indigenous language and other forms of bilingual education, the multilingual turn in language teaching and applied linguistics, critical multiculturalism, and linguistic racism, an interest that I share with Professor Penda Dobchin, who will be talking with you tomorrow. And in terms of my academic background, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. My undergraduate degree is in English, my master's is in education, my PhD is in sociology. And all of that, though, is framed by my interest in language policy and language rights. And I bring to that background also an interest in political theory, human rights law, at least in relation to language. And this work is grounded in my own country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I work in the School of Māori and Indigenous education. My empirical work focuses on Māori language education, but my language rights work has encompassed work around the world. My PhD was on Welsh language policy, looked at language rights in relation to French in Quebec, Spanish and Navajo in the US, Basque and Catalan in Spain, Irish in the UK, and a number of other areas around the world. So I'll bring some of those perspectives to you today as well. But I want to start with 3 initial observations, just for you to think about. Now, I don't want to offend anyone, but Noam Chomsky is not one of my favourite linguists. And there are reasons for that, which I'll go on to explain. But one sensible thing that he did say at one point was this in the book Language and Responsibility in 1979. Questions of language are basically questions of power. So I want you to hold that thought. And then a second comment that I also want you just to think about is from the German-American linguist Max Weinreich, who was attributed to saying this in the 1940s, that a language is a dialect with an army, navy. Again, I'll come back to this point shortly. And then one final observation that I'd like you to think about is that leaving one's culture, this is from the Canadian political theorist Will Kimlicka, and from his book Multicultural Citizenship, now almost, 25 years old, but still a very influential book, 30 years old, 95. But he says at one point, leaving one's culture, and I've added, and language, while possible, is best seen as renouncing something to which one is reasonably entitled. So I just want you to hold those 3 thoughts in terms of what I'm going to go on to talk about today with you. What I'm going to discuss is the reason why monolingualism particularly remains such a dominant ideology, language planning and policy. Despite developments, which again I'll talk about shortly, particularly over the last decade or so, that have seen a growing acknowledgement of multilingualism. But nonetheless, monolingualism still holds significant sway. And it does so in two ways. And the first way is in relation to language and the nation state, the modern nation state, and national identity. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about with you today. So if we think of the modern nation state, two key questions inevitably come up. The first is whether speaking the national language, Bangla, in the case of Bangladesh obviously, is or should be a requirement of national citizenship. And generally speaking, in almost all cases, that is the case. And the second question, the corollary to this, is whether this requirement should be at the expense of or in addition to other languages, minority languages, indigenous languages, non-dominant languages. And generally what we see in the modern nation-state system is that national languages are a requirement, no one contests that, but they are often a requirement at the specific expense of the maintenance of other languages. That's what I want to explore with you today as to why that's the case. Then I'll go on to talk about how this is also impacting in relation to English as a world language. And so what we get is one answer invariably to this question, which is public monolingualism is a requirement in modern nation states, or at the most, a very delimited bilingualism or multilingualism. Most nation states are monolingual. Those that have a number of languages tend to have only two or three that are widely used in the public domain. And this is a legacy of the nationalism of the last 2 or 3 centuries and the modern nation state model. So the ideology of monolingualism and the history of monolingualism remains very influential. In my book, Language and Minority Rights, second edition in 2012, I'm just thinking about writing a third edition, so see how that goes. But this is what I talk about in terms of language rights, and I start by looking at the modern nation state and how this has come to be. It came about round about the 16th, probably the 17th, 18th centuries. One of the key points of reference is the French Revolution, for example, in 1789, and the idea that in a modern nation state you needed this one, possibly 2 or 3 national languages to which everyone should ascribe. And so these national languages were created out of the politics of nationalism, and they replaced other languages and dialects, going back to Max Weinreich's observation, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So just by way of example, if we look at the French Revolution, it beheaded the king, but ironically it chose the king's court language, the language of the king's court, the langue d'oil, as French. So French became the national language. But at the time of the French Revolution, there were at least 8 languages spoken across what we now know as France. There was the langue d'oil, the Languedoc, Occitan as it's often known, Midi-Provençal, Catalan Basque, German and Alsace-Lorraine, Corsican, which of course was the first language of Napoleon Bonaparte, and Breton. So all of those languages were spoken across France, but French, the langue d'oil, was selected as a national language through education and the armed forces. So that now in France, fewer than 2% of the French population speak languages other than French. And that process has been replicated around the world, where national languages come to replace other languages spoken in that region. How's that done? It's achieved by language selection, in the case of France, French, standardization and institutionalization, particularly through education and civic realm. And Tony Liddicoat, the Australian linguist now working at the University of Warwick in the UK, talks about this as establishing what he terms linguistic hierarchies of prestige. That basically national languages become to be seen as important, they're associated with modernity, they're associated with progress in the nation state, and they're associated with public language domains, those important language domains that we use in the public realm. And that establishes hierarchies, which means that other languages come to be seen as lesser value use. And that results in linguistic homogeneity and monolingualism norm. And so even though we have turned towards multilingualism, and I'll come back to that in terms of applied linguistics shortly, this long-standing model over the last few centuries still very much influences the way that we see the world linguistically. In another significant book by the American sociologist David Gramling called The Invention of Monolingualism, he talks about how this has actually come to pass, how the ideology of monolingualism has become so entrenched in modern life. And he talks at one point specifically about the multilingual turn, as it happens, that whether we opt to call it a myth, mythology, a paradigm, a relic, or a sham, monolingualism is woven modernity's most minute and sophisticated political structures, as I said, and because of particularly the influence of nationalism, nation-state model. And he goes on to say that monolingualism's underlying principle has never quite been that other languages are bad or inferior. I would tend to disagree with him about this. I don't agree with this quote entirely, because I do think that actually linguistic hierarchies of prestige mean that other languages do get to be seen as inferior. But Gramling argues that they are contextually unnecessary. Monolingualism manages other languages, doesn't necessarily oppose them. So that's the world in which we live, and it's in contrast, actually, to the way the world used to be. So if we think about empires, and I'm not suggesting that all empires were multilingual, the Greek Empire particularly was much less so, but a lot of empires historically were multilingual while they were administered by a dominant force, nation. They allowed multilingualism in terms of public domain. And we see this, for example, in the Qing Empire, just adjacent to China. We think of that from 1644 to 1911, where we had Manchu, Tibetan, Mongolian, Uyghur, and Chinese languages all widely used over the centuries. And initially, ironically, Manchu was promoted as a common language for the rise of Chinese who preceded it. This is a text from the 17th century where we see Manchu working from left to right, Manchu, Tibetan, Mongolian, Uyghur, Chinese. The multilingual texts, multilingual language use, common across empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, Europe, for example, was multilingual right through to the advent of the modern Turkish state in the early 20th century, so on. So the idea of monolingualism, though it is very entrenched, quite a recent historical phenomenon. I just want you to hold that thought as well. But let me just unpack this a little bit more in terms of the modern nation-state system. Modern nation-states, as I said, were built on the notion of what we call nation-state congruence, the idea that the boundaries of political and national identity have to coincide. So the view is that people who are citizens of a particular state should also ideally be seen members of the same nationality. If they are to be the same nationality, then, so it goes, they should all speak the same language. So if we think of Bangladesh, where Bangla is spoken by nearly 100% of the population, very late, 99%, 98%, Bangladesh is an archetypal example of the modern nation-state system. And that results, as I said, in monolingualism in the public domain and overall the idea of linguistic homogeneity and the rise of national languages. And in my work on language and minority rights, what I talk about is that the fact that national languages are dominant and are often associated with modernity and progress and are at the top of linguistic hierarchies of prestige, at least in the national context. This is a political process, socio-historical and socio-political process, not a linguistic one. We're going back again to Weinreich's the language, the dialect with an army and a navy. And so we know from linguistics that there are dialects that are mutually incomprehensible and languages that are comprehensible. Think of Norwegian, Swedish and Danish, for example. They are all mutually understandable, but they're separate languages. In fact, one of those, Norwegian, originally constructed as a dialect of the Danish Empire, and then it became a dialect of Swedish, and it only became Norwegian, or the two varieties of Norwegian, in 1905. Why was that? Because Norway became a state. So states determine languages, and states distinguish between languages, national languages, other language varieties. How is it achieved? By usually two processes. One is sort of official recognition, but this is ironically not necessary. So the UK and the US, my own country, Aotearoa, New Zealand, English is the dominant language, but it's not official. It's not enshrined in legislation. It doesn't need to be. It dominates public language domains. But there are many countries where the dominant national language is official. But the most important way that national languages come to be established by this process of institutionalization, by which a language comes to be accepted, taken for granted in a wide range of social, cultural and linguistic domains or contexts, both formal and informal. And education in particular plays a key role in substantiating and establishing this process of national languages. And it's also achieved, as we know, via language standardization. Select the language, codify it, elaborate it, and we becomes established national language. So the French social anthropologist and sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talks about this as establishing a unified linguistic market or a single linguistic community. And he's talking about France here, but we can apply this to all modern nation states pretty much. In order for one language to impose itself as the only legitimate one, the linguistic market has to be unified. Other language varieties, dialects, have to be measured practically against the legitimate language or usage, so that integration into a single linguistic community like a national language, condition for the establishments of relations of linguistic domination. In another part of this book, this comes from his book, his 1991 book, Language and Power, he talks about the notion of a victorious language. So that's the national language being selected and conquering other languages. And so the result is, in the modern nation state, and with this preoccupation with linguistic homogeneity and public monolingualism, is that measured de facto against the standard and common language, other languages, minoritized languages, are found wanting and cast out into the outer darkness of regionalisms. And then the consequence of that is that minority language speakers, including Indigenous language speakers, end up being marginalized and often also pathologized, seen and viewed negatively. So Nancy Dorian comments that it is the concept of the nation state, coupled with its official standard language, that in modern times has posed the keenest threat to both the identities and the languages of small communities. And Florian Kuhlmann, the German sociolinguist, talks about the fact that the nation state is the natural enemy of minorities. And that's why in the world today, currently, we see in the approximately 7,000 languages that we know are spoken in the world today, that perhaps up to 90% of them are endangered and 50% of them are already in the process of language death because of these socio-historical, socio-political processes. And yet, the key irony is that nation states have never been monolingual. All they've done is suppress, marginalise, or ignore minority languages. So the sociologist Walker Connor talks about the fact that the homogenous nation state, the model on which our current political organisation is predicated, is actually a social and political fiction. Majority populations change over time, so history always evolves. National and Indigenous language, minority languages have always been in particular nation states. In my own country, Māori preceded the Indigenous language. Māori preceded European British colonisation by at least a millennium. And then, of course, we also have in the current state, come back to this point, the increasing evidence of migration and transmigration, what British sociologist Stephen Verdevec talks about as superdiversity. So modern nation states have never been linguistically homogenous, but nonetheless this model continues to determine much language policy. Indeed, as Will Kimlicka talks about, the political theorist whose quote began the lecture, most countries in the world have historically and remain today what he calls both multinational, in the sense that there are historical minority languages and indigenous languages that have always been spoken in a particular territory. If you think of Bangladesh Chakma or the 40 or so indigenous languages that are still spoken here, and or polyethnic, the languages that migrants bring in. So we think of Bihari, Urdu, Ringo, and we think about the increasing changes to populations, Rohingya, the refugee crisis, and so on, that impact on modern nation states like Bangladesh, as they do everywhere else. So that's the first thing. That's why I think, despite the changing world in which we live, and despite the growing recognition of multilingualism in applied and sociolinguistics, which I'll come back to, why monolingualism remains such a strong and enduring sort of ideology. And this is also reflected in the corollary, which is around ideas of language and citizenship. And I draw here in particular on political theory, but I'll come back to the reasons for that shortly. But basically, these align with what I've just outlined for you. So there are two dominant positions in relation to the ideas of language and citizenship, again revolving around public monolingualism. So individual citizenship is seen as being dissociated from one's ethnic and cultural identity. You're just a citizen, everyone's the same. You all speak the same national language. Bangla, in this case, as I've said, was different from empires. Where we do acknowledge different languages, they tend to be limited to the private domain, the notion of diglossia, which allows for the maintenance of other languages, but only in family, local communities, or private language domains, generally not in important public language domains like education. So Chakma, Urdu in terms of Bihari here, Rohingya, examples from the Bangladesh context, which you will know much more about than I do. And what's interesting is that if we look at the history of language policy, particularly from the 1960s onwards, really it's only been very recently that this idea of linguistic homogeneity or public monolingualism has come to be challenged. And so at the advent of the academic development of language policy, particularly in the late 1950s and 1960s, really we got what Suresh talking about yesterday and Robert Phillipson, the idea of the sort of coloniality being reinforced in post-colonial contexts. So language policy and planning was initially seen as non-political, non-ideological, just pragmatic responses to the problems of post-colonial states, newly post-colonial states. And what did they do? Basically, most often, they reimposed, generally speaking, an ex-colonial language, a majority language, as the language of wider communication. And minority languages were specifically limited to the private domain, so reinforcing this monolingual nation-state model. And what was very prominent in those early discussions, Jesperson and others, Cooper and Fishman, was the notion of stable diglossia. And I put stable in inverted commas because I don't think diglossia is ever stable, because if you only recognise certain languages as being able to be used in the private domain, of course, over time, linguistic hierarchies of prestige will mean that those languages come to be seen as having lesser and lesser value, and that's how language shift and loss inevitably occurs. So the notion of stable diglossia, much like the notion of linguistic homogeneity, is a fiction. And Alan Luke, the Australian educationalist and sociolinguist, talks about this as the fact that early language policy and planning tended to avoid directly addressing societal and political matters within which language change, use, and development, indeed language planning itself, are embedded. So it was an apolitical approach, the idea that this was just a pragmatic response to issues, and actually that ignored why certain languages have come to be dominant in the first place and other languages have become specifically minoritized. So they accepted, in a sense, the colonial status quo ante what was going before and just reshaped it along very similar lines in the post-colonial context. And then we have globalization. So I'll turn here to how this now works for English as a world language. Globalization sees the same pressure for linguistic homogeneity, ironically. If we think of the internet, over 80% of the internet is in English, current world language. And so there are very strong forces that see these linguistic hierarchies of prestige basically influence the growing ascendancy of English as a world language and the medium of instruction. And so Jan Blommet, the late Jan Blommet, the Belgian sociolinguist, very influential sociolinguist, talked about this in his 2010 book, The Sociolinguistics of Globalization, where he talked about a globalization in two ways: geopolitical, the result of the influence of capitalism, late capitalism, across the world, and particularly what has elsewhere been described as the McDonaldization of society, the geopolitical influence of the US, particularly on the world stage. And then he also talks about the notion of geocultural globalization that has features of late capitalism, such as new technologies, the internet, business processing, outsourcing, which I'll come back to, and the entrenchment of wider social inequalities. So globalization, basically, I will argue, enforcing the same kind of process, the same types of linguistic hierarchies of prestige, but this time in relation to English as a world language. And I'll illustrate this through just a couple of examples from political theory, just to talk you through this. So in 2001, Abram de Swan, the Dutch political theorist, talked about the fact that globalization proceeds in English. And he then goes on to say the attendant emergence of diglossia between English and the domestic language. So what we're seeing now, and this is the argument I'm making, is that globalization basically establishes exactly the same hierarchies and diglossic situation between English as a world language and now national languages that national languages did with Indigenous and minoritized languages. The same process. So people will have to live, he argues, with both English and their domestic or national language and seek a feasible accommodation between the two. This was the book that he wrote in 2001, Words of the World. And what he argued there was that languages can be determined by what he called their Q value. The higher the Q value, the greater its communicative reach, significance, and usefulness. And he identified in that process about 100 languages that he called central. So these are national languages in effect. Then he talked about the fact that there are about 12 supercentral languages, lingua franca, bearing in mind the limitations of that term, as Suresh talked about yesterday. English, Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, French, German, Hindi, Japanese, Malay, Portuguese, Russian, and Swahili, often associated with colonialism, of course, as well. And then one hypercentral language, English. And so one uses this to say and argue that English is the most significant language in the world today. Another European political theorist, Philippe van Parijs, a French-speaking Dutch theorist, wrote this book in 2011, Linguistic Justice for Europe and for the World. Classic example of the Europeans determining how the rest of the world should see things, but we won't go there. And he introduces a comparable term, prevalence. But basically, he argues that the prevalence of a language, its reach, its influence, determines its importance, basically. So again, this is an argument for English as a world language. And then he talks about the notion of probability-driven learning. So the probability that a language like English can be seen as important for communication purposes mean that people are more likely to use it, in effect. And this, of course, also underscores the rapid expansion of English language instruction around the world. English is a medium of instruction, as here at BRAC and also in terms of many of the private tertiary institutions in Bangladesh, where English is increasingly seen as the language of tertiary education in contexts where it might not otherwise be widely spoken because of this probability-driven learning. And this is related to motivation and opportunity, the idea that it's through English as a world language, so-called, that we are most likely to become socially, economically mobile and able to engage in the benefits of globalization. And so he concludes, Van Parijs, that we live in a high mobility, intense communication world. And then he talks about one other principle, the maxi-min principle, that opting for the language of maximal minimal competence for any given number of speakers in order as far as possible to achieve effective communication with all participants means that if you know English, no matter how little you know English, because of its significance, it often becomes the default language. What we also know is that when you're, as multilinguals and bilinguals, as you well know if you are carrying on in a language that an English speaker doesn't know, as soon as that English speaker joins, often monolingual, the language switches to English. And in all of this, there's a notion underpinning these concepts that basically linguistic diversity is a problem, and that basically it's a problem, these theorists argue, for communication. So we need to choose a language which is most widely known in order to be able to communicate effectively. And this also buttresses, enforces, or reinforces the dominance of English. So in terms of the time I have left, I just want to respond to these forces towards monolingualism at the nation-state level, and then also towards the same kind of linguistic hierarchies of prestige in relation to English as a world language. And I want to do that in terms of four key areas. So the first is this, that the sociologist Emmanuel Wallerstein talks about the fact that inequality, not uniformity, organises the flows across the globe. So the idea that globalization is somehow a liberating force needs to be seen critically, because actually globalization reinforces, as I'll go on to describe, existing inequalities, particularly in relation to English. And then there's the notion of what we call cosmopolitanism, the idea that if you engage in English, if you learn English, for example, you can then become a global citizen of the world, and this allows you to engage in, again, the so-called benefits of globalization. But the American sociologist Craig Calhoun calls this the frequent flyer view of identity, because it's only really those who can afford to cross borders, those who are already elites, who travel the world, who listen to Italian opera, who eat French food, or whatever it may be, who can enjoy all the benefits of globalization. Most people continue to be excluded from that process. And so we need to think of the fact that the idea of being a citizen of the world, or that English allows us to engage with the rest of the world, we need to be much more critical about that notion. And that requires us to have a critical and a diachronic, a historical approach to these questions, and also, and this is what I come to next, a situated account of Englishes, varieties of Englishes, the varieties of English that we know and speak. This is my second point. When we think of English, so-called, as a world language, we need to stop thinking of it as some monolithic category, but as a situated, contextualized, localized variety of English. And so Van Parijs, for example, in his argument for English as the new world language, and of course, interestingly, going back to de Swan and Van Parijs, they are both Europeans, both actually multilingual. So you don't have to be a monolingual to sort of argue that English should be the dominant language. Although, interestingly, most English speakers who speak it as a first language are monolingual, around about 80%, when most of the world we don't know exactly, but most of the world is between 75 to 85% are likely to be bilingual or multilingual, often simultaneously growing up learning a number of languages. So monolingual English speakers are abnormal, but nonetheless, they dominate these debates. But even when they are bilingual or multilingual, as Van Parijs, Swan are, they still argue for the dominance of English. So Van Parijs says English enables not only the rich and the powerful, but also the poor and the powerless to communicate, debate, network, cooperate, lobby, and demonstrate effectively across borders. Well, the key question is, how do they do that? How does the rickshaw wallah do that? Again, the presumption here is that it's only elites that actually can do this effectively. And Jan Blommet, again in his work on Tanzania and Africa, talks about this, is that what is globalized is not an abstract concept of language, but specific speech forms, genres, styles, forms of literacy practice, And the way in which such globalized varieties enter into local environments, such as here, is by a reordering of locally available repertoires and the relative hierarchical relations between them. So again, coming back to some of the discussion yesterday from both Suresh and Robert Phillipson, the notion that English is a lingua franca needs to be critically reconsidered in terms of some of the naivety around its so-called use. That's the second point, just two more to bring this to a close. The third point, I think, in response to these discussions around linguistic homogeneity at the national level and the I believe, naive preoccupation with English as the world language, is to interrogate this presumption that somehow a knowledge and use of English per se will lead to increased economic and social mobility. So advocacy of English as a world language and English medium instruction reinforces rather than subverts existing linguistic hierarchies of prestige. And this is a really important point to hold on to, that English is not somehow neutral and will result in mobility automatically. It's actually entrenched within these socio-historical and socio-political processes. So let me give you two examples, one adjacent and one a bit further away. We think of India, and we think of the role of English in the British Empire that we discussed yesterday, and its enduring influence in the Indian context and in Bangladesh also. It remains largely still the preserve of a small high caste elite in Indian context. It's reflected particularly at the moment, going back to the notion of globalization and business process outsourcing and information technology outsourcing. So if we think of academia, what we know is that most books now are published through India and or other contexts in the global south. And this is an economic move from large publishing companies who wish to minimize cost, but it's also leveraging off the colonial legacies of English in these contexts and their relationship to particular, usually high status elites. If we look at Africa as another example, English is an official or co-official language along with French, again a legacy of colonialism in many nation states. But interestingly and ironically, those states that have English or French as a national language tend to be the poorest in Africa. And if we compare them with the so-called Asian tiger economies, for example, Japan, Korea, for example, Singapore, English does not necessarily need to be the dominant language for a nation state to succeed. And the other aspect is that in those states, in Africa, where English or French is a national language, there are actually very few speakers speak those languages on an everyday basis. And that results, and Jan Blomet talks about this again in his book on globalization, what he calls low mobility forms of English. So English may be very important, for example, in African towns for purposes of local trade, but if those African English speakers were to relocate to London, Jan Blomet argues, then they would be reconstructed as sort of low status English speakers. So this is where context becomes particularly important. And we can think of this also not just in relation to English, but if we think of Bangla as a national language, which pretty much everyone speaks in Bangladesh, but if we think of how Bangla is constructed in the UK, Bengali, it's called there, reconstructed as a low status language, as also if we think of Spanish, which of course is a national and colonial language in many contexts, particularly across South America, but in the US, Spanish is reconstructed as a minority ghetto so-called language because of the politics of English as the dominant language of the US currently. So what we need to understand is that just having a particular variety of English doesn't necessarily mean that it will be viewed positively. And it's still those who have access to high status standardized forms of English, American English, British English, and of course if they are first language speakers of those languages even more so, those are the ones who have the real economic and social power. And so just to conclude this particular section, and then I've got one more and then I'll close, another political theorist, the Canadian political theorist Peter Ives, talks about this in relation to English specifically. He says learning English or any dominant language is not inherently detrimental in the abstract, but the context in which it occurs often means that it helps to reinforce psychological, social and cultural fragmentation. Thus, a global language like English can never fulfill the role cosmopolitanism, this idea of engaging in the world, globalization, sets for it, that of helping those who are most marginalized and oppressed by globalization to be heard. It's a very good recent book by Matthew in the series edited by Alistair Pennycook, Multilingual Matters, that looks at Indian mothers from low castes in the southern India, I think, and how they use, or they think that English medium instruction will be the avenue for their children to succeed economically, and how in most cases that doesn't generally occur. So again, the idea of which language varieties are being spoken, EMI often occurs in contexts, and Pramod will talk about this in the next session, in contexts where English is not widely spoken, and so access to the forms of English may not necessarily be useful beyond those contexts. And why is this problematic more generally? Well, basically because the presumption that English as a world language will somehow open up the world to us is basically what is a purely instrumental view of language, that language is just a tool of communication divorced from social, historical, political contexts. And so it's reductionist, inevitably. It constructs linguistic diversity as a problem, and this is why we have language shift and loss around the world, and why that is exponential, because it establishes these linguistic hierarchies of prestige and the emphasis on language replacement. It implicitly and explicitly presumes the communicative superiority of so-called majority languages, as if they are linguistically superior, even though they are only in those dominant positions because of history and politics. And it reminds me, just a segue here. So in America, for over 100 years, they've been trying to make English an official language of the US, because like the UK, and New Zealand is the same, English is not an official language in the US, it's just the dominant language. And then there's a related presumption by English speakers that the US was always a monolingual nation state. Well, they had over 500 Native American languages to start with. German was the most widely spoken language other than English in the US up until the First World War. And so the idea that the US was monolingual is a fiction in itself. But it did lead to some spectacularly stupid views of history. So in 1987, on public talkback radio, a Republican politician was arguing for making English an official language of the US. And his argument was brilliant. He said, if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. And of course, if we think of the languages that Jesus might have spoken, well, he would have been multilingual, of course. His probably everyday language was Aramaic. He would have known Hebrew, Greek, and Latin because he was in the Roman Empire, but English, not so much. So often we also get a kind of historical ellipsis, a very bad understanding of history when we come to these issues. But the presumption of communicative superiority rests on this monolithic view that we have this undifferentiated notion of English, and it fails to examine, as I've argued, how prestige language varieties are linked to existing elites. And in this construction, minority languages are seen as useful perhaps for identity purposes, and maybe not even that. So this is why minority and indigenous languages continue to be seen only in the private domain. Again, the political theorist Helder de Schutter talks about this as in this way. So an instrumental language ideology sees language as external, as a tool simply, rather than something we use for identity. And it's there to enhance communication, efficiency, equality of opportunity, mobility and social cohesion. And that's why language homogenization is still so prevalent in the world today. So in my own work in language and minority rights, I talk about the response to this, and I'll just draw this to a close. So what I argue in my work around this is that there is no need for nation states and there is no need for an understanding of globalization to continue to be monolingual. And I draw on the work of the German-American sociolinguist Heinz Kloss, who distinguished between what he called tolerance-oriented language rights and promotion-oriented language rights. The tolerance rights are those that allow languages to continue to be spoken in the private domain, diglossic situations in effect. Although we do know that in some states today that is not even allowed. So if we think of Kurdish, for example, in relation to the Turkish state, or Tibet and some other language varieties in China, where minority language speakers are still oppressed for speaking their own languages. Promotion-orientated rights is the recognition of languages in the public domain, particularly through education. So the idea of bilingual education as one means, for example, of recognising languages. This is particularly important for Indigenous languages. In New Zealand, Māori language has been re-established as a language of education over the last 50 years, part of this Welsh, very similar context. That's Heinz Kloss. Kimlicka, who I mentioned earlier, the political philosopher from Canada, Will Kimlicka, talks about the difference between what he calls group differentiated rights. And so basically what he argues, going back to the idea that Walker Connor highlighted, that all nation states are actually multinational. They have national and Indigenous minorities, and polyethnic. They have migrants. And so we should recognise this linguistic diversity, not just privately, but publicly. And then in my own work, I've talked about this in relation to language rights specifically, and also added that where ethnic minorities, who tend to be ignored completely in most of these debates, that they should actually be recognised where there are sufficient numbers of them, so that they might too have access to bilingual education. I've argued that national and Indigenous minorities should have that as of right, but that migrants where numbers warrant and where the state should reasonably be able to cater or acknowledge that, would also have at least some rights. This is, as I said, I'll just draw this to a close so I won't belabor this, but this is Kloss's work from 1977 that I draw on, the distinction between tolerance and promotion-orientated rights. And then Kimlicka's work, national and Indigenous peoples should have this as of right. If we think of the Bangladeshi context, how that might apply for you. And ethnic minorities should have this where numbers warrant. Let me just close in by a very brief discussion in 4 minutes, around some very recent developments over the last decade or so in applied and sociolinguistics. One paradigm that's come through very strongly is this notion of superdiversity. As I said, this was first developed by the British sociologist Stephen Verdevik in 2007, who outlined the massive increase of migration and transmigration as a result of globalization, but also new technologies and the internet. And he was particularly interested in London, and he looked at how London had become both increasingly multi-ethnic and multilingual. And so this was then taken up by a whole range of other disciplines who argue that we are becoming increasingly diverse. And in sociolinguistics, we've focused increasingly on the complex, fluid, multilingual repertoires of migrants, generally in urban contexts. This is a really significant shift because at least it acknowledges multilingualism as the norm rather than monolingualism, which still underpins a lot of so much of language policy and planning. But in a recent article in Sociolinguistica, I also talk about the limits of this, where I talk about the fact that multilingualism has only really been rediscovered, only when it's rediscovered by the global north that it becomes important. Global south has always known this, because simultaneous bilingualism and multilingualism is the norm. It still continues to ignore or pathologise Indigenous languages, coming back to a point that Suresh made yesterday, I think it fetishises or overemphasises the significance of agency that somehow and doesn't address structural constraints that continue to establish these linguistic hierarchies of prestige. And a focus actually on individual repertoires and the rejection of so-called speech communities, which is also a feature of this more recent work, actually undermines the notion of language rights, because if you don't have an identifiable speech community, such as an Indigenous language, then you can't attribute any rights to it. So I've written about the limitations of that. And the other point historically is that urban migrants are not the only key stakeholders in this. We've always had multilingualism, particularly in colonial contexts and in relation to Indigenous speakers. So in my other work, I've focused on this in relation particularly to language teaching and policy, but I won't talk about that today, and I'll just conclude with a very brief comment around this notion of complex diversity. So I think complex diversity is a more useful term than superdiversity. This comes from the work of Peter Krause, first published in my journal Ethnicities. 2012, and he has a recent article in 2024. And what basically Krauss does is he basically looks at all key stakeholders. So this is something for you to consider. Who are the language stakeholders in Bangladesh? The majority ones, those that have always been here, Indigenous language speakers, but have been marginalised, and then new migrants, Rohingya, Bihari, and others. And where do they sit in the language ecology of this space? And he basically says we need to address all of those groups, and we need to not lose sight of the wider structural inequalities that continue to demarcate those groups, both in terms of their social, historical, political status and their language status. It retains a non-essentialist understanding of language. Language changes, it always evolves, and multilingual repertoires remain complex, but it addresses these structural inequalities, I think, more directly, linking the micro and the macro in terms of how we might address wider systemic inequalities. So I think it's a useful issue to consider, and the PowerPoint have references at the end if you wish to follow up. So just to conclude, what I'm suggesting is that what we have seen is a very sort of modernist view of language arising from the nation-state model that is linear. So again, coming back to Suresh's critique of linearity, that it sort of moves from so-called local languages to global languages, or through national language. And we need to question that unidirectional, that linear sort of understanding of language development. Diglossia we need to problematize, because if languages are not publicly recognized, they will inevitably shift and die over time. May not happen straight away, but it will happen. And so the public recognition of languages, particularly Indigenous languages, remains very significant. We need to complexify the simplistic assumption that just knowing English as a world language will somehow open up the world to us. Because, as I said, it's contextualized, often dominated by elites, and it's particular English language varieties that tend to be recognized, not others. This leads us into critiquing English medium of instruction, something for you to consider, and related monolingual teaching and learning practices that still dominate in those contexts, which exclude other languages, which see translanguaging as problematic, which still see native speakers as better than non-native speakers, and so on. We need to reconnect identity and language use. Many monolingual English speakers think that English is both the best language and the most useful language, but it's also the language that defines their identity. So if language is important for communicative purposes, it's also very important for our identity. Those identities can be complex and shifting and fluid, but they are identities nonetheless. And so therefore we need to accommodate much more directly multiple linguistic identities, and we need to link or reconnect all language users, so that we end up celebrating a multi-directional language policy that encompasses both the local and the global, that's recursive, that's not linear, and that is able to accommodate the complexities of the modern world. And so I come back to Suresh Kanagaraja in his book, The Local and the Global in Language Policy and Planning in 2005, which is a fantastic book if you have not read it. And Suresh notes there that celebrating local knowledge should not lead to ghettoizing minority communities or force them into an ostrich-like intellectual existence, but rather a clear grounding in our location gives us the confidence to engage with knowledge from other locations, deconstruct and reconstruct them for our own purposes. In a sense, such an epistemological practice would lead us beyond the global and local dichotomy to enhance, to address and acknowledge multiplicity and multi-directional nature language policy. So thank you very much.